For that glorious introduction, and might I say I'm a little nervous, primarily because this is going live, right? Yeah. So I earn my salary, as I was telling people earlier, that I earn my salary by being controversial and I can't be controversial if it's going live. So part of my presentation will be skipped over. But thank you, IISER Bhopal, for having me here. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be among young minds, young scientists, people who are going to shape tomorrow's science of India. Thank you very much. The thing that I'm going to talk about today is science journalism. Have you heard about it? That's a very feeble yes. Okay, so I take it for granted that most of you haven't heard about the genre called science journalism. And believe me, something like that exists. And that's why beasts like us exist, right? Science journalists, science editors. So you have an amazing event in Singularity, which again is not known to a lot of people outside of your own world, right? And when I came to know about Singularity and the kind of things you would be doing during the 4 days, three or 4 days, I thought, why don't more people know about this? And that's where it all begins. Stuff that nerds and scientists do, primarily sit in their labs most times, and very few people outside those labs get to know that stuff. And I get, again, my salary by taking that stuff out of these labs and events like this into the public, into the masses. So people must know what's happening in here, in your labs, in ways and manner, in a manner that is comprehensible, that they can understand. So that's what science journalism primarily is about. If I were to very basically define what it is. And why do we need it in today's age and time so much? That would also be one of the focus areas that I'll speak to you about today. Well, since the hall is dark now, I can't see most of the faces, but I intended to ask a question, and that was, how many of you have ever, yes, thanks, have ever read a science piece in a newspaper or a magazine, or seen a piece of science story in an audiovisual, say a news channel, and thought, well, as a kid, and well thought that I want to be something like this when I grow up? That's like 75% of you. Yeah? So that's crazy, right? How we get shaped by things we read or see or hear, or stuff that is communicated to us over the years when we are in our formative years, when we are becoming something, when we are starting to mold our thought process, and then that really impacts us as what we become finally, right? So that's again a big role of communication for you, hands down. That could figure as an example of why communication is needed, especially in the science field. I'll begin by a short video on the secret life, of a Nature paper. And why I want to show you this video is because most of you in this room will identify with how a manuscript is written, what happens to how science is done, what happens to all the science you do, how is it communicated to your own peers, and is there a side to it that you don't know yet? So we'll come to that in a bit.
How does new scientific research get from here to there? Let's take a look behind the scenes. Every week, Nature receives around 200 online submissions. That works out to more than 10,000 manuscripts submitted every year, and Nature's team of in-house editors carefully considers each paper they receive. The most promising papers then pass through a rigorous peer review process, where international experts assess their novelty, validity, and significance. They often recommend revisions or additional analysis, and the editors work closely with the scientists and reviewers to improve the paper. Around 8% of submitted papers pass peer review and are selected by Nature's editors for publication. Once a paper is accepted, it goes into production, where a lot of things happen to it at once. Sub-editors make sure that every detail in the paper is perfect and that the scientific arguments are made clearly. Art directors design and customize the pictures and graphics. For some papers, leading scientists are commissioned to write additional commentary and analysis on the research, while the multimedia team records podcasts and shoots videos. And within a few weeks, the paper is finished and ready for the most important part of its life, publication. Nature's marketing and press teams publicize the research and organize press conferences to announce especially significant findings. The paper is also published digitally on mobile devices such as smartphones and tablets. And as always, it appears on Nature's website, which gets almost 8 million page views per month. But the life of a paper doesn't end there. Nature's focus on high-quality research means that the paper is read by many other scientists who will use the findings to inspire even more new research. Soon enough, the original paper gets cited in new ones. And its life goes on.
Okay, so that's the secret life of a paper, if you will. Most of you know how manuscripts are written, or will know in the coming years. But you saw a bit where the paper gets a life of its own beyond the manuscript. So its news, views, the impact goes beyond just the publication. Podcasts, videos, all of that is made if the paper is newsworthy. Even if there's a small basic research, incremental research, even then if it is making news, if it is newsworthy, and I'll come to what is newsworthy in a bit, and for journalists like us, what do we look out for when we want to publish stories about people like you? What is it that we are looking for, right? So there are more ways to swing it. There are more ways than just a manuscript writing or communicating your science to your peers alone to swing it. And I get back to one of my favorite writers, the Russian playwright Anton Chekhov. I don't know how many of you have read his stories growing up. I'm sure you have. Maybe don't know the name of the writer, but many short stories that Anton Chekhov wrote have impacted many of us in our lives. And so he says, don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. That works for me on multiple levels. Why do I say that? It works for me on a philosophical level, because you see, that actually looks like water, glinting, shimmering water, but you can make out that there's a moon up there because it's dark. There's glinting happening under there. You don't really need the moon in the picture to tell you that it's night and it's moonlit, right? So it also works for me on another level, that is, you're saying things that people can understand and not necessarily be told in black and white, right? So for you, evidence is king. For me, content is king, right? I don't mean to say that for me evidence is nothing or for you content is nothing, but there's always a sweet spot between evidence and content that we can all look at and start thinking about as we start our careers in science as we begin to explore how things are done more than what has to be done, right? So that moon up there was not needed in the picture, but it's still there telling you that there are many things that can be said in many ways, not just needed to be said in black and white. I take you back to 11 November 1869 because that's where nature's journey started, and I give this as an example. There are many, many reputed journals that you know of, and that's the first issue of Nature, and that's the mission statement of Nature. And what does it say? It says the Weekly Journal of Science wanted to ensure that the results of science are rapidly disseminated to the public throughout the world in a fashion that conveys their significance for knowledge, culture, and daily life. So you see, it transcends just the idea of communicating science. It gets into other spheres of life. And I was just discussing with my friends here about the fact that we have lost the P in PhD soon enough, right? PhD is supposed to be absolutely. So where's the philosophy in PhD? Where have we gone? Have we not put on blinkers? And I'm trying to inculcate this thought in you because I want all of you to think about interdisciplinarity, about opening up your minds to other spheres beyond science, which actually impact how you do your science eventually, and which actually separates the grain from the chaff, if you will. If you are to become something beyond just lab nerds, then that's where all this lateral thinking will come into play. So you see, the front half of Nature, which is actually nothing but commentaries, news and views, stuff about the scientific community, how it's shaping policy stories, policy stuff, all of that. That's the front half, and that came into being way before the back half came into being, right? And why was that so? Because people were interested to know what the scientific community does on a daily basis in these labs. And so manuscripts were the second thing that happened to Nature. Earlier it was simply the news, views, commentaries and opinions. Nature India we launched in 2008, so we are like, and we have an archive that goes back to 2007, so about 12 years old, and we serve the working scientists in the world's largest democracy, but we have readers across the world, and a lot of people who are interested in India's science, which is actually quite a handful, come to Nature India to read our wares. I'll take you quickly to the main crux of today's talk, and that's science journalism and why I'm here today. What is science journalism? Journalism actually does all of that you saw. It impacts policy, it takes your science across to a larger group of people beyond your peers, it actually impacts next generation scientists. You know that because you all have in some way been impacted by something you read somewhere when you were growing up, etc. So, you report on the latest, that is the adrenaline part of science journalism. So, you are in the know of and thick of things, and you get to know things way before everybody else does, like journalists do, and then you sort of report on those stories beyond just the peer community. I keep saying if it's science happening in India, it is on Nature India. This is a short commercial break. So, we pride ourselves for being the most in-depth in covering science in India. How many of you have seen Nature India? Well, that's impressive. That's impressive. It's an award-winning website. It's won in the last 12 years, I don't know how many, several awards, global awards, national awards, for its coverage, for its quality, for its multidisciplinary approach. So, we've been awarded by the Kavli Foundation, which is the Kavli Foundation. So, we've been awarded by the World Federation of Science Journalists, by the World Investigative Journalists Forum, etc. And mind you, this is competing with mainstream media, because investigative journalists is, again, it's a huge community, and you know what kind of stories they do, what kind of stories they break. So, when we get those awards, it's a validation of the fact that science journalism in itself is something to reckon with. It is in itself a field that is not to be seen slightly, right? So, I think that with each of those awards, the stories that we do gets another very strong impetus. We tend to think that we are competing with the mainstream media in covering just a niche area of journalism, that is science journalism. We reach millions of readers worldwide, feature research highlights, which are short snippets of research done in Indian labs, and writing them in a manner that is accessible, understandable, makes an impact on common people's lives, not just on the community. We do interviews, reviews, opinions, commentaries, as I said. We cover conferences which are of importance, and we bring to you the jobs and events from Indian science to, that would matter to the community. We have special issues that are editorially driven. We produce an annual compendium. Do you get that in your library? I don't know if you receive that. If you don't, you should. And we do a lot of outreach activities by way of workshops, by telling the scientific community how to write English as opposed to writing science, right? So, and how to communicate your science better. So, all of that we do. Well, let's come to the core of what journalism in the scientific field is and how it is very similar to what scientists do. So, these are some buzzwords: science, journalism, problem, investigation, stories, and solutions, which apply to both scientists and science journalists, because you and I both live by these standards, by very high rigors of pursuing what we pursue. There's a method to it, there's a madness to it, and there's chaos, and there's absolutely, in the end of it, this high adrenaline rush for what all we do, right? I don't know how much that is in your day-to-day lab life, but for me as a science journalist, it's a daily deadline, right? The deadline is here and now, and I am supposed to be delivering stuff by the evening every day. So, it's very similar in many ways, but we can talk about more, and please feel free to ask in between if you want to anything, because by the end of it, maybe most of you would be sleeping. So I don't want to miss any questions that might be cropping up in your head. Okay? And I'll be brief. I'll not take the one whole hour with you. I'll be as brief as possible. So scientific research, what does it do? It is, in a way, questioning in an organized manner the things that we all want to question. It begins with a problem or a hypothesis. It compiles information chronologically, one after the other. You always keep asking questions, what is known, what is not known, but we wish we knew. We keep checking, rechecking and reviewing so that no aspect of the investigation is left untouched or uncovered. That's almost the same thing that a science journalist would do. You see how similar these two pursuits are. For a science journalist and a scientist, curiosity is the number one thing that we all want to do, right? Somebody's laughing here. He's seen the last bullet. So a science journalist is also as curious as a scientist. Both of us have hypotheses we want to prove or disprove. We both gather evidence towards establishing those facts or figures or data. We both want to be read, you by your peers, I by my millions of readers. And for both of us, mistakes are visible and mortifying. It can make or mar our careers, right? And we can talk about how the media is the favorite punching bag for everything that's sensational, everything that goes wrong with your quotes, misquotes, misinterpretation of stuff, and all of that. We can keep talking about that later. But yes, if I were to write a story that misquotes somebody or misrepresents facts, my reputation is at stake. You will not read my second report. I keep saying a science journalist is as good as his or her last report. It really makes a difference in the minds of our readers. They'll not come back to me if they've read something that they have not liked or not understood or thought that is factually incorrect. But where we differ is you would always want results however dull it is, but I would always want a story, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, many people confuse science journalism with popular science writing. Can somebody tell me what the difference is between these two genres? Any guesses or ideas? Even if they are totally not in there? No? Yeah?
I think for the science journalism, the thing should be direct. Like, I will not take chunks of exact or significance, whatever it is covering, direct. But for a popular writing, you need to have some background or something like that to make up a story into a big form. Like, it should have many parts. But for a science journalism, if a news is there, it should be direct.
That's one part of it, yes. What is the most significant difference? I mean, for science journalism also you have to have some background. You have to have some knowledge of or building up of the story. Yes, I agree it has to be direct, much more direct than popular science writing. But what is the one most important aspect? New interesting stuff, right. I just gave you the answer a while ago. You were not listening. Yeah, so I'll tell you the answer. For science journalism, it is journalism, right? It can't wait. Yeah, so it's here and now. The deadline for every story is limited. It has to be told tomorrow morning. So it is current. For a popular piece of science writing, it can wait. It can build on, ruminate, think about, it can have its body of background and it can build on that forever. It can take 10 years to be written, even a small piece, but science journalism cannot wait. It has to be today or tomorrow or even this week. If it's an investigative story which you need to ruminate over, it again has to be 10 days at most, right? So it's current. That's the basic difference. You can communicate science whenever you wish to, however you wish to. You can talk about, say, a supernova or a cancer cure or say something in astrophysics. You can talk about them whenever you want to in a popular format, but you cannot talk about something like a Vikram lander story 10 days later, right? It has to be today. It has to be right here, right now. So that's the basic difference, and so that's where the absolute adrenaline comes from in this pursuit, in this profession that I work in. We'll talk about what makes a good story, and this is for all of you because you're sort of building your life, a career in science, and it is very important for you to know what is a good story in your labs that can be communicated to the media and that we expect to tell our readers. What are those things that we look for in a good story? Relevance. How relevant is your research or the piece of work you're going to talk about? Does it make sense to a lay public? So things like diseases, new drugs, climate change, genetically modified food, these would immediately make sense for a lay reader. So relevance of the story. Interest. That's a dinosaur picture from Brazil. It's an artist's impression. One of our Italian artists, Jorge Blanco, actually made that thing. So interest, results that are unexpected, unusual or amazing, and dinosaurs are always amazing, aren't they? So astrophysics, new planets, new galaxies, anything, new supernova, new black holes, anything so which is enigma inducing is always of interest. First, you can recognize the sky? No? You guys got to read up. Yeah? Yes? Yes? He didn't disappear, he's still around. He is Chinese, yes. No, it doesn't have anything to do with disappearance, his nationality. No, he's the Chinese scientist, He Xiong, I think that's how he pronounces it, who created the world's first CRISPR babies, genetically gene-edited babies. Yeah, and he created a lot of storm by just announcing that he's created those babies. So firsts make news. The first sequence of a species genome or the first CRISPR babies. There's an answer right there. Okay. Research that relates to emerging or topical news can generate more coverage than it would otherwise. All of you know what this is. You know where it is. None of us knows, but we do know where it is. So research that is up and coming and now and current generates more news, would be interesting to a science journalist. A celebrity high impact authors many times become news themselves. Whatever they say, whatever they do, wherever they go makes news. Can you name a high impact author from India, or do you know some rock star scientist in India? Ashok Sen is high impact, yes. A rock star scientist? Okay, I give it to you. CNR Rao. So whenever these people will open their mouths, it will make news, right? That kind of rock star status they got to have. And I'm sad most times that we really don't have too many of those scientists who make news. Because world over there are people who sort of rise up to the occasion in the community, in the scientific community, and say things as they are. And it's important for the mainstream media actually to quote people like that over and over again, just so that science remains in the news, just so that their views, the community's views, are projected in the mainstream media. So it's important. Images always make for great stories. Sometimes they are stories by themselves. This is a new species of vine snake which was discovered a couple of months back, I think in August, in the Western Ghats. It made news because it's such a wonderful picture, and there were several of these pictures taken from various angles which we used in our stories. So let's come to a little bit about how academic writing that all of you will either take up or have already done is different from how I write my stories. Okay, for you, this would be the sort of format that you use in your manuscripts, in your stories, in how you communicate science. You would go for a broad background. You would then go for a specific background. You would state your problem or motivation. You would come to your methods, results, the context of your finding, and conclusions, and the so what question, the implications. So what? You've done all that, but what happens next, right? What are the implications of the story? And many times you have acknowledgements, etc., down there in the paper. How does that differ from how I write my stories? For me, the conclusions are important, and so should it be for you when you attempt to write in a popular format. So the conclusions of your findings are something that people are interested in, to know what happened. You've been doing this research work for say 10 years or 5 years or 7 years. So what? That's important for a lay public. The key findings come next. The implications of your story, of your research. What problem are you stating? What are you resolving? The context, and if I still have space left, and if my editor is willing to say, okay, you can go beyond 400 words, and that's a huge lot in popular science communication or in science journalism, then you go to the broad background, and that's how your story ends, right? So these are things that you might want to keep in mind when you want to communicate your science beyond the reach of your community. Let's try and understand this beast, as I call it, called science journalist or science editor. What are the pressures they are working in? What are the kind of things we got to know about them before we call them names, before we call out their reports, before we tell them, oh, you messed up with my story, or you misquoted me, or you misrepresented the facts, or your headline was too obtuse for anybody to understand or for the scientific community to get to, right? You got to understand that science journalists really struggle for space. Like I said, if I am given beyond 400 words, that's way too much. And so we are struggling constantly for space. That may not be true for online media, but even then you've got to to hold the reader's interest, right? So the outlets are actually giving them that much space. So it is that much in depth only that they can get, right? You've got to know that the fracturing media landscape, by that I mean lesser and lesser number of media houses exist which cover science. And so they have to cover a whole lot of things, and like you heard in my bio, I've been covering a huge number of things before I became a full-fledged science journalist. So it was also Bollywood, also sports, also economic journalism, also all sorts of things. So that really gave me a wonderful background, an interdisciplinary approach to science, about thinking in hydra heads, about how I do not restrict myself to just thinking in terms of science. So that happens a lot of time to us, and we are struggling to do more than meeting just the demands of a press release that is sent out from a press team of, say, IISER Bhopal or Indian Institute of Science or IITs, etc. So that's another thing you've got to keep in mind. Many decisions that are taken in a newsroom, but in the manner in which the stories have to be written, are actually beyond the control of the journalist. So the headline, I always have a great example. I've not included that in this presentation because you're going live, so you're missing out on a lot of fun. But come to me and I'll tell you about those examples, about how the headlines many times do not say the thing that is in the story correctly or factually. So it's misleading most times, and so science stories are generally accused of being biased towards sensationalism as well, just as much of journalism is, right? Oh shit, no, sorry. We're going to skip that. Okay. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Can we have a 5-minute question or session, ma'am, if
Sure.
it's fine? So if any one of you have any...
So I just need to clarify that those slides are in camera and I can talk to you about them when you come to me. And it actually talks about how science is covered in the popular media and how we tend to cover it in a more balanced, non-biased, non-sensational manner, and how that's different and why all of you should also know that.
Let's have a quick 5-minute question or session.
Sure.
Ma'am, over here.
Yes.
Good evening, ma'am. It was a great talk. So, if a scientist or practicing scientist after master's or PhD try to take it as a profession, science journalism, then what should be his or her approach?
Absolutely.
And how
Great
we should
question.
proceed?
Yeah, I get that question very often, and I think that for journalism and to get into the field of communication also, the one thing that I think is most essential is having a nose for news. You know, all those things that we discussed about relevance, interest, all of that. You can take up a course in science journalism or journalism after your master's, but most important is the learning in the field. And I think that you learn by being, just like you learn by being in the lab more than you learn in your school practical classes. I think it's just the same. For you to understand the relevance and also have a flair for writing are the two most important things for me, for you to take up science journalism as a career. Does that answer your question? Yes. So there are ways and means of approaching the editor of a newspaper or the editor of a science journal. You can, for us, you can just shoot an email to me, and we'll see if the story or the article that you're pitching to us makes sense to us, in the sense it could be something that our wider readership, global readership, will be interested in. And so all those pointers that I gave you were actually clues or cues for you to hold on to in case you want to write any of the science that you wish to.
Hello, ma'am, I'm Ashak. So, like in addition to the social relevance of a certain kind of research, do you also discuss about the political repercussions that certain kinds of research will have?
Absolutely. So, I always keep saying that a science story is not just a science story. It has an angle which is economic, by which I mean, do you see a science story in demonetization? Do you? What is it?
Bagul mic did it.
I mean, I'm not sure, but like,
Yeah, so
you can
so for something like, say, it's an economic story, right? Demonetization, or a financial story. And for me as a science journalist, it has an angle in science. So, have you heard about the security ink in the new notes that were introduced? There's a science story there, right? So, when the world was talking about, or the mainstream media was talking about demonetization, a lot of stories that skipped their mind were rooted in science. And so, those are that's what I mean when I say nose for news in science. So, you have to pick up those cues. You really have to see how you can go beyond just being nerdily infected, if I may use the word. So, so for me, there is a political story in many science stories. The way the science policy is shaped in this country has a lot of things to do in how the grants will be given to the institutes, how it percolates down to your own research in the lab. What happens in Jammu and Kashmir, for example, when Article 370 is promulgated. And so you sort of know that the researchers there will be sitting in their labs without getting funding for a long, long time. That's a politics story, right? But it impacts the scientific community. So, did I answer your question? Okay.
Do we have any other questions?
yes, over here. Oh.
Yes.
Ma'am, I'm Aditya.
Yeah.
How do you see science journalism through the perspective of advertisement for certain labs or certain institutions?
Okay, so if I got your question correct, you're asking how a lab or an institution can become project its face onto a popular science communication field. So, I think lots of newspapers do cover new institutes, new labs, or even new initiatives in existing labs or institutes. So, I think, there's always something of relevance to the readers by way of how a lab functions, what it does, more than the fact that it got so many crores of rupees to create a building. So if you're looking at the science that is being done in that lab, or the interesting or the novel things that are happening in that lab or institute, that makes for a good pitch for an institute to go and tell the world about their science. So, again, did I answer your question or did I get it right? Okay.
Hello, Miss. I'm Anubhav. I had a question which does not have nothing to do directly with science journalism, but I think you would be in the unique position to answer it. So, I feel in general when we go up in the internet, see the general news, India does not make a lot of science news that impacts the world in general, the whole world in general, which I feel like many countries like US and nowadays US, earlier it would be UK and other European countries, India does not do a lot of science that impacts the whole world in general. Like, do you have any ideas on like more in-depth insight on it, and like how can we improve on that? Like, are we falling out of context? Like, are Indian research falling out of context? Like how can we solve that problem, or is it a problem at all? Like,
It certainly is a problem for all of us. But to answer that question, we'll have to sit for at least an hour debating about the state of science in this country, or discussing the state of science in this country, and how less than a percentage of GDP continues to be pushed into or given to research, R&D in this country for long years, despite a strong need by the scientific community, or lots of noises being made every year before the budgets, before the allocations, that we should pump in more into our research. So one aspect of that is certainly the funding. The second aspect, according to me, and however little I know of how science is done, is also the mindset and attitudes of doing science in a strictly bureaucratic, hierarchic kind of situation. And again, this is off camera, but I'll be very docile in answering this. I'll not go aggressive. I think the whole idea about how science is done in this country boils down to the fact that science funding is the lion's share of science funding comes from the government, and the government has its own set of rules, its own way of functioning, and its own. Well, you got the answer right. So we. But having said that, we see pockets of brilliance even in that setup that are being created across the country in the way science is done. And one of the pockets, if I were to name them, are the ICERs. And I do know that the ICERs, for example, or the NCBS, TIFR, these are institutes that stand out because of their non-hierarchical culture and their position on irreverence. Like, you don't have to call your teachers sir all the time. I mean, it's rooted in our culture, yes, of course, but also the fact that you can challenge your superiors. You can be irreverent in science, and that's the whole point of science, right? That we sort of become people who can question. Science questions all the time, and that's how it progresses. So, did that answer your question? Fine.
Okay, so final 2 questions only.
Right.
Hello, ma'am. Myself, Chandramali. Consider a hypothetical situation in which
I'm always afraid of hypotheses. So, but go on, shoot.
In which a scientific evidence can destabilize the way of life as we know it. So, how would science journalism approach it? Like, would they let this evidence come into the general light, or like would they keep it as a secret?
Well, science journalism can't afford to keep it a secret. So I'll not get my salary if I were to keep things secret, right? I get paid because, and I know all of my friends, peers, colleagues understand the value of bringing things to light. So one of the things that we do on a daily basis is challenging convention as journalists, not just as science journalists, but any journalist worth his salt, her salt, would be challenging the status quo, would be challenging questions or situations that need not remain the same. And science keeps doing that. Science evolves by challenging the status quo. So I think there are parallels in journalism and in science, but in the manner we do it, in the manner we approach it. So yes, of course, one would certainly want to unravel those secrets every day.
Okay,
We
so
have
final
time
question.
for last question.
Yeah, last question.
Ma'am, I really enjoyed your talk. how deeply involved is science, is the world of science journalism in inculcating a scientific temper, especially in remote areas wherein which unfortunately do not have much access to media items and all technology, etc.
Yeah. I got your question. Thanks. That's actually a brilliant question. I think that bulk of science in this country is done in English, and bulk of science journalism also is done in English. That's a bane for a multilingual country like ours, where we really need to bring science to the grassroots. And much as I would love to take science to the masses in Hindi or Marathi or Bengali or at least in those regions where science is something that people value and would like to know more about. Yeah, we still have a long way to go. So what we essentially do to overcome that barrier is create some science programming in Hindi on radio, because that's the channel that reaches a lot of people. And so some of, voluntarily I go around and speak in Hindi, which I don't know how good my Hindi is, but I try and create a space for science in the popular medium, which is radio, which takes us to way more people than, say, a science journal or even a newspaper. So yes, we have a long way to go in disseminating science in regional languages.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was an amazing talk.
Thank you for being
Please.
patient, and thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am has been a perfect example of how determination and perseverance helps you excel in your field and take you to uncharted heights. So once again, please, a big round of applause for ma'am.